Welcome to Gold and Blue, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget, you can send gear to represent your team for the background of Gold and Blue forever. Just send gear to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina 29657. Let's get to the next video. Yesterday, whenever I first started hearing that Florida State was leading talks between the ACC, Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford, I was thinking, I don't know how likely that is. But I'm hearing from more and more people that this is a true story. Florida State is trying to single-handedly save the ACC by trying to get those 4 brands from the Pac-12. And a lot of people think that that wouldn't add much value. I disagree. Number one, it's because of how low the TV deal. Now, if the ACC had a TV deal that was already comparable to the SEC and the Big Ten, then yeah, I would say, nah, those 4 teams would not bump the revenue up in the ACC. But the fact that the ACC does have such a terrible deal, then yeah, I think those 4 brands would add some revenue. How much? I don't know. Would it be enough for everybody to be happy and stay in the ACC? I don't know. But I do think that it would stabilize the ACC, and at least the ACC would be prepared if teams do leave in the future. And this is what I've been preaching to the ACC. You need to prepare yourself because I do think you will lose some members in the future. Now, if they're able to lock in these 4 teams before those 8 teams vote to dissolve the grant of rights, then that might not even happen because they wouldn't have the numbers to do so. But if this is just a backup plan because they know teams are going to leave, then this would be able to fend off the Big 12, and then the ACC could turn around and try to focus on the Big 12. So what could happen out of this? The ACC goes out and gets Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and Cal as a backup plan, right? It does happen. Now, those 8 teams do vote to dissolve the grant of rights, so they will lose some brands. So let's say Florida State, North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia Tech, they go to the Big Ten. Clemson, Miami Hurricanes, NC State, and Virginia Tech head off to the SEC. Well, with the ACC grabbing Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford, they can actually keep those last 4 teams I have going to the Big 12 from going to the Big 12. So they keep the Big 12 out of their backyard. That is the key to the ACC's survival, because I do think that there will be teams leaving for the SEC. I do think there will be teams that leave for the Big Ten. Who goes where is anybody's guess. I've given you my guess, but it could turn out to be something else. But I do think 8 teams will leave, 4 to the Big Ten, 4 to the SEC. And I've already given my idea about this. If I was the ACC commissioner, I would get ESPN back to the negotiating table and say, hey, we'll cut these grant rights in half if you give us more money. That way you can get the teams you want into the SEC sooner rather than later. But this helps us prepare for the future and be an attractive conference because we will need to backload when you take those teams, and the Big Ten will probably take some teams as well. So if they can fend off the Big 12, that is the key to the ACC survival. On top of that, with Arizona and Arizona State not being happy with how the Pac-12 is negotiating with ESPN, I heard that they had a deal and that ESPN actually pulled that deal because Disney is actually trying to make cuts. ESPN could come back and offer again, but that offer would be much, much lower. And that's why Arizona State and Arizona are not happy and are willing to talk to the Big 12 as far as jumping to the Big 12. And I do think that Colorado and Utah would join them in the Big 12. So the ACC fends off the Big 12. They're able to keep Boston College, Wake Forest, Louisville, Pitt, Syracuse, maybe Duke if they don't get picked up, or Virginia Tech, whichever one doesn't go. And then don't forget about Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford. That's 10 teams right there. So you're still okay. You fended off the Big 12. You added 4 teams from the Pac-12. You're at 10 teams. You're still in good shape. And that's when the ACC could look at the Big 12 to bridge the gap between the East teams and the West teams. Yes, of course, you know I'm going to mention West Virginia in this particular scenario. It would just make too much sense. The rivalries would still be there for West Virginia to make money for the ACC. But on top of that, the ACC would need to get teams out of the core of the Big 12 to make up for the gap between the East teams and the West teams. Basically, your bridge. Now, the ACC could also think about adding Memphis. That would get them closer to the West side. It would give them a solid footprint in the state of Tennessee. Nobody is talking about Memphis right now, and yet Memphis is investing $200 million into the Liberty Bowl. It is going to be a state-of-the-art stadium for Memphis. It will be an eye-catcher, and I do think they will raise their value as far as potentially jumping to a Power 5 conference. So the ACC could take a look at Memphis, and I know Memphis and West Virginia for that argument aren't great in academics, but desperate times call for desperate measures. But on top of that, they could look at teams like, I don't know, Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State would be a great fit in this scenario because they're in the Midwest, Southwest, whatever you want to call it. And they would be right in the middle between the East teams and the West teams, and it would bridge that gap a little bit. But on top of that, they could also add a Kansas State, or an Iowa State. Now, let's rewind a little bit. Remember, I'm saying the Big 12 will probably add Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. So even losing those 4 teams, they're still at 12 members. So even the Big 12 is still good in this scenario. The conference that takes the major hit in this particular scenario would be the Pac-12. They would be going away. 4 would be going to the ACC. 4 would be going to the Big 12. That's the conference that would be taking the biggest hit. But this battle would be between the ACC and the Big 12. The ACC would try to fend off the Big 12 when those major brands leave for the Big 10 and the SEC. And by grabbing Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford, that makes it more feasible, and you still have 10 members. At the same time, the Big 12 will have to fend off the ACC because the ACC will have a better TV deal because of pulling those 4 West teams and renegotiating their TV deal. So it would be a tug of war between the Big 12 and the ACC. If the Big 12 wins, then they're looking at a 16-team mega conference blueprint that could help them exist exponentially into the future. If they lose, they're back down to 12, which is not terrible. Maybe they could also pick up Oregon State and Washington State, bump that back up to 14. Because remember, I have Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford going to the ACC, so they're off the board. Washington State and Oregon State are still on the board. And this would actually be a dream scenario for Oregon State and Washington State because out of all the teams in the Pac-12 that don't want the Pac-12 to dissolve, those are the 2 brands that want it to not dissolve the most because they wouldn't have a landing spot unless that Washington State bill passes and attaches Washington State and Washington at the hip. So wherever Washington goes, Washington State would go as well. So maybe that would be their ticket to the ACC. But I'm not putting my eggs into that basket. So I'm saying that Washington State and Oregon State would be desperate at this time. So they would actually hope that the ACC would be able to get 4 teams out of the Big 12 because that would open up some spots. And I do think that the Big 12 would add Oregon State and Washington State. So let's say that the ACC loses those 8 teams. They grab Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford from the Pac-12. The Big 12 grabs Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. And let's say that the ACC wins this tug of war. You get West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Kansas State from the Big 12. The Big 12 then adds Oregon State and Washington State. Even if the ACC doesn't go after Memphis in this deal, they get West Virginia, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and Kansas State. This would actually open up the door for Memphis to join the Big 12 because the Big 12 would be losing 4 members. They could add Oregon State, Washington State, Memphis, and Boise State. So honestly, if you're a Memphis fan and you're a Boise State fan, you also want this scenario to happen as well. Then the question becomes, is this enough for Notre Dame to finally join the ACC as a full-time football member? And who knows, maybe it is enough. I think if this scenario plays out, that both of these conferences would be in good shape at the expense of the Pac-12. Now, I don't think this is going to happen. This is like 5 steps ahead of reality, so I'm not predicting this. But I'm saying this would be a great scenario, both for West Virginia fans and for Washington State and Oregon State fans as well. If you're a Washington State or an Oregon State fan, you better hope that this scenario happens. Otherwise, your future might be in the Mountain West, and I know you don't want that. Y'all in the comment section, number 1, do you think those 8 brands are destined to leave the ACC and that the ACC is getting Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford to prepare for those losses? The only thing that makes this not make sense is that Florida State is leading the way in the talks. Maybe they're just trying to be a good citizen and help out the ACC. I don't know. If that does happen, the ACC grabs those 4 members, do you think the Big 12 would grab Washington State, Oregon State, Boise State, and Memphis to bump their numbers up to 16? They would still be a super conference if that happens because remember, they're still getting Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. So even though they're losing 4, they would still have 12 members. And then they would be adding Washington State, Oregon State, Memphis, and Boise State. I'm telling you, both of these conferences would still be strong even if the ACC got 4 members from the Big 12 to come to them to make sure that they still exist. I'm telling you, this is a perfect scenario for both the Big 12 and the ACC, even though the Big 12 would be losing teams to the ACC. This one's blowing my mind. I don't think it's going to happen. Man, if it did, wow. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next show.